At last, a radio program for the people who pay big government's bills, not those who make big government's bills. Welcome to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome, Gimme Radio listeners. We have a special treat this week in Mr. Joshua Culling, who is probably the best traveled man in all of the National Taxpayers Union's personnel roster. He's been out traveling the states, lobbying in the states, and the news is actually good. We may fret about middle-class tax increases coming from the Obama administration. We may fret about small business tax increases coming from the White House. That's going to be a very hard fight in a Congress that seems determined to raise taxes, but at the state level, we are fighting back, and in many cases, we are winning, and we're going to tell you at the end of this how you can help us win. So, here, after culling a lot of examples of taxpayer revolts around the country, is the appropriately named Josh Culling. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Pete.
First, let's talk a little bit about some of the victories we've experienced because of National Taxpayers Union's involvement out in the states. I understand something got blown away down in Arkansas recently.
Yes, in Arkansas, not 5 days after the governor signed a grocery tax cut into law, he came back and was considering a new tax on milk, basically just an excise tax on anything that any dairy products or anything that contains milk, which is a phenomenally stupid idea, and it basically would have reversed half of his grocery tax cut. And we fought long and hard to get that defeated and ultimately won. So there will be no new regressive tax on families who want to feed their children healthy beverages.
Yeah, imagine that. If anything could be more regressive, if anything could be more difficult for families to afford at this time, this recession, it's got to be this milk tax. I mean, think not only of the milk you drink, but the milk products that are going into grocery stores today. Cheese, cheese food, even candy contains some dairy products. So that chocolate bar you're eating could go up in price. It was a very difficult fight, but your National Taxpayers Union was on the front lines, and we were able to knock it down.
Absolutely, yeah. We sent a letter to the governor and the legislature saying essentially what you just said. I mean, it's a regressive tax on families, and even furthermore, it's a tax on something that's good for you. I mean, you're basically saying, don't buy that gallon of milk for your family for dinner. Give them soda pop.
Well, and at base with all of these new tax proposals, or I should say most of these new tax proposals, is the notion that, well, we've got a budget gap, and the only way we can close it is by pouring more revenues into the gap. Well, many of these states have been spending, if not wildly, then quite irresponsibly over the past few years. That was even true in Arkansas, wasn't it?
Sure. Yeah. One of our strategies on defeating some of these tax increases at the state level is reframing the issue. I mean, the government wants to tell you that it's a revenue problem, that they need more revenue to provide services or whatever it is that they do with that money. But really what it comes down to is it's a spending problem. I mean, you look at, for a number off the top of my head, over the past decade in Illinois, where they're looking to hike a number of taxes, spending has increased 45% while population has increased 4%. So they just keep throwing more and more money at the problem, and then there's your $11 billion budget deficit that they're facing in Illinois. So the governor wants to hike the income tax 50%. He wants to hike the cigarette tax 102%. They floated the idea of a gas tax hike that never actually came to fruition. But, it's what we try and tell these politicians is you need to get spending under control.
It's interesting. I've seen this phenomenon, and I'm sure you have at the state level, this federal level notion of the current services budget baseline. States are actually imitating that. That sounds like a big term, folks, but what it basically means is the federal government, when it's budgeting, assumes a built-in increase in spending every year. And if a given department doesn't get that built-in increase, suddenly they're claiming their budget has been cut. Well, only in Washington and now in state capitals would anyone call that a cut. I recall this is exactly what happened in the state of Maryland last year. There was an actual budget surplus being run, and because Martin O'Malley, the incoming governor, had such an ambitious healthcare and education agenda with a huge spending hike, he basically created a deficit out of thin air and said, we have to raise taxes. Maryland did not have to raise taxes. All it had to do was shelve some of its ambitious spending plans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of what you see when you that's where a lot of the wasteful spending comes in government agencies. Is if they're budgeted, say, $100 for something and it costs them $90, they better spend that extra $10, or else they're subjected to maybe not, making it more public that they don't actually need that money. So these people, they just spend and spend and spend. And one of the more, we've been playing a lot of defense, but one of the ideas that NTU can play offense on is using the current economic downturn to push spending caps, hard spending caps on the growth of state government, because we've had a lot of traction with our members and with taxpayers in the states in saying if you would have had a hard cap on the growth of government spending 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't be in this position right now.
Yes, that old song, Deep in the Heart of Texas, comes to mind. Isn't there a spending limit fight going on there?
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure how successful it will ultimately be, but Representative Ken Paxton introduced, I believe it's House Bill 994, which would basically limit the growth of government to the rate of inflation plus population growth. A study done by the Texas Public Policy Foundation on this bill showed that if such legislation would have been enacted 10 years ago, the government would have saved something like $30 or $35 billion annually.
Incredible.
Just because of how it just explodes.
See, folks, this is based on a concept that voters enacted in the state of Colorado way back in 1992 called the Taxpayers Bill of Rights. That formula of inflation plus population growth as a spending limit is becoming popular all over the country. In fact, voters in Maine will be able to decide a measure that has that formula in it. And don't let anyone tell you that a taxpayer bill of rights would cut spending. All it's doing is limiting the future growth of spending. It's saying, okay, whatever you need to provide for the current government programs, the current services, you're going to get, plus any costs of living increases, any population increases that cause you to have to expand those programs, we're going to give you that. But if you want more, you either have to pass it through the legislature by an extraordinary majority, like 2/3, or you got to ask the people.
Yep. Yeah, and that's something that you run into a lot when we talk about Taxpayer Bill of Rights or TABOR. Those who profit from government spending try and play, they use a lot of scare tactics to say, well, we're going to be cutting every service that any woman and child enjoys. The fact is, under Tabor, government spending continues to grow. It's just capped basically at what it is now. It allows for when more people move into the state, you spend a little bit more money for them. I would argue personally that government spending in almost all 50 states is too high as it is. So this isn't even ideal for me, but I think it's the best kind of pro-taxpayer spending cap that we can enact.
I know that the budget situation in California is on the minds of many Gimme Radio listeners, not only those who actually live in the state, but those who actually live around the state, because the neighbors bordering California often benefit from the migration of people who are sick of the Golden State's taxes and want to keep more of their hard-earned money. And boy, are they coming after people with a vengeance now.
Sure. California is... There are no words to describe how bad the situation is out there. I mean, they quote patched a $42 billion budget deficit, and then the next week said we have a new $8 billion budget deficit, which will undoubtedly grow. People are literally leaving maybe the most beautiful state in the continental 48 in droves because they are just getting taxed to death. There are further income tax hikes on the table in the General Assembly now after they just hiked a bevy of taxes. I've talked to folks who are active in state government in California who just basically throw up their hands. I mean, no one knows what to do. The state needs to hit the reset button and start all over. And what it needs to do when it starts all over, the first item on the agenda needs to be a hard spending cap.
Well, and the interesting thing there in California, it gives lie to this notion that politicians like to put forward when they're facing very immediate budget crises. They say, don't worry, these tax increases will only be temporary to get us through this crisis. We will lift those taxes just as soon as a rosier economic picture appears. Well, here in California, they're not even waiting to ask voters to make these things permanent. The budget legislation that passed imposes new tax hikes, and there's going to be a vote on a ballot measure in May to extend them further. They're breaking their own promises even before their initial round of tax increases expires.
Absolutely. And one interesting thing to keep an eye on is that May ballot that you referenced. I mean, if voters reject these further tax hikes at the ballot box in May, they have to go back and start all over again to plug the deficit. I mean, it really is mind blowing how bad of a situation is out there. And I see more and more politicians throwing their hat in the ring for 2010 to run for governor. You could not pay me $10 billion to run that state right now. I mean, it's not possible. So, we say that the $42 billion budget deficit has been closed, but it could just completely unravel if voters don't approve the 5 or 6 measures that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one illustration of how bad it is, folks. In California, there is a proposal on the ballot that would extend an already agreed upon 1% increase in the sales tax. Now, 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but again, this is 1 percentage point, not just 1%. And in some areas of California, when you put the local sales tax on top of it, you're exceeding a 9% sales tax rate. I recall even one community has it above 10%. Then California, unfortunately, would join Chicago, Illinois as having a 10% or worse sales tax burden. And to my mind, 10%, that is a psychological barrier almost that you pass as a taxpayer. The difference between 9% and 10% is not just 1 percentage point. It means a whole lot more, I think, in people's minds.
Sure. And, with all these tax increases in California, it's basically becoming the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, you look at the income tax hikes, people are leaving because they don't want to earn income in California. Sales tax hike, if they're staying in the state, they're going across state borders to buy things because they don't want to be robbed by the government. So I really do think that it's kind of reached a fever pitch out there in California, and people, they see that the government's not going to change, and they're looking elsewhere.
Well, not to make people depressed, because I think there's a chance that these ballot measures will fail in California. Not just a chance, a good chance, because people are fed up there. But what about another victory among many? I believe there was almost legislation passed in Georgia that would have gotten rid of some slush fund, was it not? We came very close there, right?
Yeah, there was basically in Georgia about 10 years ago, they created a universal access fund that basically was designed to help out rural telecom providers who had trouble with access fees. And over time, that it served its purpose basically, and that universal access fund basically morphed into an unaccountable, opaque slush fund, paying for all kinds of things that had nothing to do with rural telecom companies, had nothing to do with the telecom industry at all. I mean, we're talking about roof repairs on a cabin for a couple $100,000 in North Carolina, not even in the state.
Incredible.
Yeah, it really got bad, up to the tune of, I think, $8.5 million a year. So NTU was really active in that fight to basically eliminate that slush fund.
Okay, so that was a very close call. We almost got that passed, but I understand in Indiana we prevented a tax hike on the very popular satellite TV services out there.
Right. As part of the omnibus budget bill, there was an amendment offered that basically would have created a new 3% tax. I'm sorry, 2.5% tax on satellite TV providers. It's kind of, the cable TV lobby likes to try and, quote, level the playing field by getting taxes enacted on their satellite counterparts. It's pretty much, would constitute the government picking winners and losers and just kind of arbitrarily singling out one segment of commerce. So we were active in that and helped to get that struck from the omnibus budget bill.
Yeah, you had a Freudian slip there, Josh. Winners and looters, right? Yeah, absolutely. This bill would have cut some taxes for cable subscribers, but then raised them for satellite subscribers. That's what's called the bait and switch in tax policy. And Indiana can do better than that. We're not here to pick on the cable industry. All these customers deserve relief from these burdens, and that was something this proposal was not doing.
Certainly. And it's, it's a case where the government, it just seems like the government's chasing you around finding what they can tax because, the economy's bad. People aren't going out to movies. So they want to sit on their couch and watch a movie at home one night. Oh, well, here's a new surcharge on your satellite TV. I mean, whether you use satellite, cable, or analog, or listen to the radio, I think that it would really help out the families of Indiana and of other states that have pursued similar policies to cut them across the board.
Well, that about wraps it up for this segment. On behalf of all our 362,000 members, I'd like to thank Josh for all his hard efforts. Our members are spread all across the United States, 8,000 in Indiana, well over 30,000, I believe, in California, thousands in almost every state in the Union. And so this is why we're talking so much about state-level activities. They apply across the board in most places to convince taxpayers that they can help. And how you can help is to sign up for our text messaging service. That's a very great way of getting up-to-the-minute news on what your state lawmakers are doing and what you can do to persuade them to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, we at NTU, kind of our niche in the conservative movement is our grassroots membership and activating those members to advocate on pro-taxpayer policies. So we're always looking for better ways to organize and motivate them to take action. Text messaging is kind of the next wave of keeping citizens informed of what's going on both on Capitol Hill here in Washington and in their state capital, and making sure that they don't miss a beat when it comes to both good and bad economic and fiscal policy.
Okay, so how do we do this? How do people sign up for this?
All you have to do is take out your cell phone and text the word FIGHT to the number 54608.
FIGHT to 54608. That's FIGHT to 54608, folks. Well, that was my version of a late April Fool's Day joke. We didn't really wrap it up before. We're really wrapping it up now. Thank you so much, Josh Culling.
Thanks for having me.
And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, we're speaking of state taxpayers. And continuing with that traditional theme for this show, we are going to talk about the outrage of the week. And this is a doozy, folks. And just because it applies to one state does not mean it doesn't apply to other states, which is why all you Gimme Radio listeners need to perk up your ears and listen to these awful details of what's going on in New York State. Natasha.
Yes, Pete. In New York State, where NTU has more than 17,800 members, there are thousands of dollars in state taxpayer-funded earmarks. Anything from $15,000 for the Newburgh Rowing Club to $25,000 for free concerts on Long Island to $20,000 for theatrical performances in Queens. All in all, $200 million in earmarks doled out this year by lawmakers in Albany. And this is a problem. I mean, it would be a problem in any economic climate, but especially in times such as these when, most states are facing budget shortfalls and most states are receiving, billions of dollars in federal stimulus funds. I don't know the exact figure, Pete, perhaps you do, and what New York is receiving, but if they're going to be asking for federal handouts, they probably should not be spending millions of dollars on these kinds of questionable projects.
Yes, it is not necessarily the proverbial drop in the bucket. It's more like a cup in the bucket. But still, it sends a signal to taxpayers in New York State and wherever else this occurs in other states that this doesn't matter, that they don't matter, that whenever there's a budget deficit, taxpayers should just ignore the earmarks behind the curtain and pay higher tax rates. That's not something we should tolerate. When we say, for example, that the chimpanzee trainer in New York deserves funding, when the Long Island Farm Bureau deserves funding, when $20,000 for a railroad museum is a wise expenditure, this is all ridiculous in light of the fact that we have to make budgetary priorities. I'm not against free concerts. I'm not against theatrical performances. But the problem is these state officials come to taxpayers and say, we've cut everything we possibly can. There's no more fat. There's only meat on the bone. Please pay higher taxes. And these projects obviously give lie to that notion. So folks, if your state is crying poverty, if your state lawmakers and governor are saying you have to pay higher taxes, ask them this simple question: where's the pork? Cut that first, because I can tell you, in New York State, the pork is bad, but it's probably worse in other states, so don't let them deceive you.
And I just found that figure. New York State is expecting to receive $11.8 billion in stimulus funds. They're also facing a $16 billion budget deficit. So once again, some of these projects are just not, in the cards right now.
Yeah, so when you figure that the federal stimulus money is coming in, part of that can probably be used to offset the $16 billion deficit. If they were to get rid of this pork barrel habit too, well, that would make at least a significant down payment on addressing the rest of the deficit. But New York State seems unwilling to do that, and they're doing what's called really the Washington Monument Syndrome. That's something that the government here has done in the past when there have been questions over whether a new budget would be enacted into law. The first thing lawmakers say is, well, we're going to have to close all the museums on the mall here in Washington, including the Washington Monument, in order to make economies and keep the budget from going further into the red. That's just a political game to make the most visible thing, the most visible service or trapping of government, the showcase for paying higher taxes. So that's what these governments do. And again, don't be deceived by it. Well, we've gotten you suitably exorcised about all of these horrible examples of government waste, and now you're asking, well, what in the world can I do about it? We're not going to let you off that easily, Gimme Radio listeners, because we have something you can do about it. And what you can do about it is attend our National Taxpayers Conference coming up in the Washington, D.C. area between June 11th and June 13th. Is that not correct, Natasha?
Yes, it is, Pete. National Taxpayers Conference 2009 will take place June 11th to 13th at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, just outside the nation's capital, a short taxi or one metro stop away from Reagan National Airport and just a few metro stops outside the city. You will be able to attend training sessions on how to run a taxpayer group, how to fundraise, media training, how to effectively use social media. You'll also hear from inspirational speakers who have fought City Hall and won, along with current and former elected officials. We're still finalizing our speakers rosters. We'll have exhibitors from national and state level pro-taxpayer groups and think tanks who will have a wealth of information. What else, Pete?
Well, just a few of the speakers to remind Gimme Radio listeners. We've got former Missouri Governor Matt Blunt, who is an expert on government transparency. That involves setting up online searchable websites that citizens can use to see where their tax dollars are going. You've also got Ken Blackwell, former Treasurer and Secretary of State of Ohio, very experienced in tax and expenditure limits and ballot measures. Also, David Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States. Why is that an important position? Because he is the one responsible for reporting to Congress on all things fiscal. And as former Comptroller General, Walker is leading the fiscal wake-up tour to try and get people to think about our coming entitlement crisis and do something about it. So not only are these speakers coming, we're going to have authors that you know very well doing book signings, opportunities to socialize, nuts and bolts seminars. If you want it, you got it. If it's about taxpayers, National Taxpayers Conference will cover it.
And we just extended our early bird conference registration rate of $99 through April 13th. It was set to expire at the end of March, but we have extended it just in case you didn't get a chance to sign up. You can do so on our website, www.ntu.org. You can register, see the latest conference information and speakers list, get hotel information, everything.
Well, again, folks, that's www.ntu, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, ntu.org. Well, that does indeed wrap it up for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm Pete Sepp.
And I'm Natasha Altamirano.
Remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power, and that means listening to Speaking